that you slaughter the korban with, does it have to be a klishoris? So what's the question? The Gemara says explicitly that in Sota, that although when you slaughter, the blood is already sanctified when you slaughter, nevertheless you need an additional sanctification that the blood has to go into a klishoris. So you have a double sanctification. Initially you consecrate the animal is kodush, is consecrated for the mizbeach. When you slaughter it, the blood, as you slaughter it, again is consecrated. That's called kedusha shchita. When you receive it in the ministering vessel, an additional sanctification comes upon it. And then you continue. So Tos has a question, what is mekadosh the dam? What sanctifies the blood? Is it the act of shchita? It's not the vessel you use. So therefore you could even use an ordinary knife. Even the knife itself was not a ministering vessel. The act of shchita, that's what consecrates the blood. Slaughtering the animal, which is consecrated, the act itself causes the blood to be consecrated. And then, but you have to receive the blood in a ministering vessel. So therefore it will be similar. The knife, and why does Tos have the question? Because the halacha is that shchita is ksher bizarre, that even a non-Cohen is qualified to do the shchita. So if a non-Cohen, you cannot consecrate something that goes on the mizbeach. So what does the act of consecration? It's either the kli, the vessel, or it's the act of shchita. So if the act of shchita brings about the consecration, one doesn't need the knife doesn't have to be a consecrated knife. You can even use an ordinary knife. Or do we say no? It's the knife which consecrates it. And Tosfos leaves it unresolved in this. The hand of the Cohen, only the Cohen could do the kmitza. By mincha, a non-Cohen cannot do the kmitza. And it has to be done with his hand. So if it has to be done with his hand, it's clear. It's not the act of removing it, but rather it's the hand of the Cohen. That's what he says. He can't make a vessel which has the same capacity as the hand, which is a kmitza, because it's the hand is the only klishoris, so to say, which is able to bring about that level of consecration for the kmitza itself. That's the difference. The Medrash tells us, as all the Rishonim say it, that when a person brings the korban, the animal in his own place, what basically is it? In terms of midas adin, he should be the one to be slaughtered, his blood should be sprinkled, his remains should be burnt. Midas Rahman says you take the animal in place of, instead of the person. So the blood ritual is the closest thing to the human being. As a result of that, we could say that you don't have to consecrate the animal being consecrated in the place of the person. That is the person. What is mincha? Although we find there's 4 stages which correspond to the 4 by the animal, but it's flour. It's not the same thing as the person being slaughtered, and Hashem is willing to take the animal in the place of the person, as we said, name of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. Because if you have to do tshuva, if you have to repent before you bring the korban, so we can't take a functional, intelligent being for the act of something which is equivalent of an animal. Because we say that when a person sins, he's not fully in touch with the senses. He's not classified as an intelligent being. So therefore you take an animal to atone for the action of an animal. Now that he's being the korban, he's no longer classified as an animal because he does tshuva before he brings it. The mincha is not exactly the same thing, although you have the 4 corresponding stages in the mincha which correspond to the korban. Yes.
So, is there 0 designation in terms of the mincha? In other words, the same way there's a high level of designation, consecration with the korban.
No, it has to be. You have to consecrate it.
So it's not so.
No, we mentioned yesterday when you consecrate an animal, what we call magdish an animal, the animal immediately assumes kedushas mizbeach.
Right.
Wait,
But is there anything
wait, wait,
comparable
wait,
to
wait,
the,
wait, 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 wait. When you consecrate the measure of flour for the mincha, it does not assume that kedusha. It's only once you put that flour in a mincing vessel, only then does it rise to that level. That has relevance to the mizbeach. Okay, so which means the animal in its own right is the human being. Immediately, it's in its own right. It's the human being. As a result of that, it assumes the immediate consecration. Verbal consecration is enough to bring it to that level. The flour, these granules of flour, although in its volume is a certain volume, it's not the equivalent of a human being. It's not that level of representation. As a result of that, when does it assume that special level? It only receives kedushas mizbeach only once you put it in a mitzvah vessel. Before it's the mitzvah vessel, it's called flour designated to be used for a korban. An animal, when you consecrate, it is a korban. It's a korban immediately. It is the sacrifice. Now you have to go through the stages to validate it to be put on the mizbeach or to bring about what we call kapora atonement. The animal immediately, the moment you consecrate it, it is that entity. The flour, it's designated, but it's not that entity yet. I'm just making these differentiations.
So the moment you designate it and it becomes hegdish.
You're talking about the flour or the animal?
What?
The flour or the animal?
The animal. Then why wouldn't you need a knife that is a cliche?
Because I would say this is it, that the animal. No, the reason that was because the animal is the person. The animal is the person. The mincha is not the person. So you have to bring it to that special level. You have to initially, it only assumes that level of kedusha only when you put it in the mincing vessel. You understand? The animal is the equivalent of the human being. So how do you get it? How does it have relevance to the mizbeach? You say, this is my equivalent.
Exactly.
Flour is not the equivalent of a human being, unless you put it in the mincing vessel. Because the animal is in its entity is a living species, like the person is a living species. So when you consecrate, immediately it assumes that special level of kedusha.
So therefore,
the flour, until you put in the mincing vessel, it doesn't have kedushas mizbeach.
Right. So then it sounds like you wouldn't need a knife that is a cliche.
That's the question. That is the question. That maybe not. So how does the blood have its kedusha? So Tosa says it's the act of shchita that gives it its kedusha. When you go and you slaughter it for the mizbeach, that the act causes it to have kedusha. It's not the knife. Except how do you slaughter? You slaughter with a knife, but it's not the innate kedusha of the knife which sanctifies the blood. It's the ritual of shchita that's what causes the blood to be elevated, because now the blood has relevance to be put on the mizbeach due to the shchita. It's not due to the knife. It's due to the shchita. That's the question. Is it due to the knife, which has kedusha, which does the shchita, or no? The knife can be an ordinary knife. The reason why the blood has kedusha is because the act of slaughtering caused the blood to be qualified to put it on a mizbech. So the act of shchit itself gives it elevates it to that level, because that now it has relevance to the mizbech.
Rabbi, I'm asking, when a person designates the animal as a korban, doesn't that give it the level of status that it could be shefted on the mizbeach?
Yes.
So then why do you need anything else after
No. No, because you need multiple levels of kedusha. Now this animal has relevance to the mizbeach, right? It has relevance. Now we start the ritual. So the Gemara says, when you slaughter it, the blood becomes sanctified. The blood becomes sanctified. Just the act of shechita. When you do the shechita. So the Tosha has a question. Is it the shechita that's what brings it to that new level of kedusha? Because now the blood has relevance to the mizbeach. Giving its relevance, that gives it the kedusha? No. It only has the kedusha because you use the mincing vessel, which the knife is hegdish. That's what caused it. I mean, logically, I would say, and that's what Tosha says, since we find that even a non-Kohen can do shechita, so evidently, It's not that special ritual. It's not the ritual of a Cohen. Therefore, what gives it its kedusha? It must be the shechita, because the blood, it's the animal itself availing its blood for the mizbeach. Now we talk about something else. Now the blood has to be received in a ministering vessel, and only a Cohen is qualified to do. It's called mikabel avelech. So if only a Cohen now, once the Cohen gets involved, it's because he allows a new kedusha to be assumed. If let's say Yisrael would accept the blood in a ministering vessel, has no value, it's possible, correct? But the vessel's holy. But since it's called the ritual of a Cohen, the Cohen is the one which causes it to be elevated to that. It's a Cohen in combination with the vessel. Therefore, now it assumes that new level of kedusha. Okay, so there are three levels of kedusha. There's the consecration of the animal, there's the shechita, and then there's the what, and then you have the receiving in the vessel. Now, there's a discussion like this. Okay, talk about a little nedarim. There's a we'll have at the end of the Chumash Vayikra. There's a concept known as Tamura. If you consecrate an animal, then you take another animal, and you say B should be like A. I consecrate a shlomim, an ola, and I take the identical species, and I say I want B to be like A. What's the halacha? Normally, when you want to transfer kedusha, the kedusha goes off A, goes on to B. But when we deal with a korban, the kedusha does not go off A and to B, but rather the Torah says, "Hu tumurasa yekodesh." A remains A, but B assumes the exact same status as A. That's called tumura. Okay? We find the same thing by nedarim. Nedarim, the Torah tells us that if you have something which is kadosh, and you want to say B should be like A, B should be like A. What's the halacha? B becomes like A. That's the halacha. It's called hatfosa. I want B, the concept pigeon is, I say this loaf of bread is off limits to me. Neder. Then you say loaf B should be like loaf A. So B, although you didn't say it should be forbidden to me, you just it should be like A, it becomes forbidden. Takes on a forbidden status. That's called yodayim. Although you just said, you alluded to what you meant, but we understand what you mean, B becomes like A. So the Gemara says, why? Because it says lindor neder. Neder is the vow, but lindor, even through association of something else to that, it also assumes the same status. That's the Gemara in the Dorim. So Gemara has a question, what about if you take a piece of pork, which is not permitted, and you say, B should be like A. Kosher piece of meat, B should be like A. Does B become like A? So Gemara says it doesn't. Why doesn't it? Because the Torah says you could only say B should be like A if it's davar anodor, if it's created by man. If it's a prohibition which is created by human being, like a neder, B becomes like A. But something like pork, that's not a man-created prohibition. That the Torah created that. That's what's forbidden species. Therefore, when you say B should be like A, B cannot be like A. Okay? That's the Gemara. That's an explicit Gemara in the Dorim. So the Netziv asks a question on the Rambam. Now, if you have a kosher species, a male species, specific, a goat, a sheep, or a calf, and it's the first issue of the womb of the mother, what's the halacha? Upon birth, it's a bechor. A bechor is sanctified by who? That's a Torah sanctification. The person who owns the animal doesn't consecrate that to be a bechor. It naturally becomes a bechor. Correct? So if you have a bechor now and you want to say B should be like A, it shouldn't work. Because the kedusha of the bechor was not created by man. That was created by the Torah. If you consecrate an animal and you say be like A, so why is A consecrated? Because that's through human consecration. So therefore B becomes like A. But a bechor, which is the Torah causes it to be in that consecrated state, When you see B should be like A, it doesn't work. Okay? And the Gemara says it doesn't work. So the question is, the Rambam says that if you have a piece of meat, which is Bechor meat, the Cohen slaughters the Bechor as a korban. Now he's a piece of meat that has Kedushas Bechorah. And he says B should be like A. B becomes like A. So they ask on the Rambam, the Gemara says explicitly, that only something which the prohibition is, the status is created by man, then when you say B should be like A, B's like A. But Bechor, that its Kedusha status is created by the Torah, you can't. So how does the Rambam say that if you take a piece of meat of Bechor, which is only permitted to the Kohen, and you say B should be like A, B becomes like A, and B is only permitted to the Kohen, not to a non-Kohen? That's the question asked on the Rambam. Alan, you have the question. Okay? So then the Tzif says some what? Go ahead. What? He shechted it.
Yeah, so therefore it's man created that status of the meat.
Very good. But the Tzif says the same thing, but just explain what that means. So the Tzif says the Rambam's not talking about you had an animal, which is a Bechor, and you say B should be like A. Animal B should be like A. That would be like the pork. What happens when you do the shechita? We say the act of shechita consecrates it. It adds to that original status of consecration, as we're saying now. It's either the knife consecrates it or the act of shechita consecrates it, but who brought about that elevated new level of status of Kedusha? That was man-made. That's not divine. Of course, initially the Bechor is a Bechor. That's created by God. That's Torah. That's a Torah Kedusha. That's not created by man. So if you take another animal and you say B should be like A, it doesn't happen. It's like saying pig, you have a pork, and you say B should be like A, it doesn't happen. Because it's only Dover Nodur. It has to be man-made. But once you slaughter dealing with a piece of meat, so that meat, it's not only Bechorah have a Kedusha because initially it was born as a Bechor, because it was advanced the Kedusha, because when you did the Shechita, it brought another level of Kedusha to that meat. Therefore, that additional level is what? Is man Kedusha. Man-made Kedusha. It's not Torah Kedusha. Therefore, when you say B, and that's what Ram says, is you're saying, you took a piece of meat of Bechorah. It's not you took the animal. You took the piece of its meat, which is ready for the coin's consumption, and you took B, it should be like A. That's why B becomes like A for that reason. So it's exactly what we're talking about. When you put the flour in that mincing vessel, the flour itself assumes Kedushas Mizbeach. Right? So there, again, the mincha is, how does that Kedusha come about? Everything is verbal consecration, and then you put it in the mincing vessel. So there, from the very start, it's like consecrating an animal. I say this animal should be a shlomim, and you say B should be like A, B is like A, even before the slaughtering. Because how did the animal become a shlomim? Right? It wasn't born a shlomim. It's because man designated it should be a shlomim. But Bechor, that's not the case. Let's say we'll talk about Meiser Behema. The Torah says when you have a flock of sheep or animals, you count to 10, and when you say 10 is 10, automatically when you say the 10, it assumes a level of carbon. It's called Meiser Behema. It has the same status like a shlomim. So in that case, how did the 10th become the 10th? Because you called it 10. Right? If you wouldn't have designated as 10, it's not that it doesn't assume Kedushas. It's not Meiser Behema. So by Meiser, if you would say an animal should be the equivalent of the 10th, that animal becomes the equivalent of the 10th. Because that's only through his designation, when you said 10, that it assumed the status of Meiser Behema. That's like saying Shlomim. Okay? Therefore, there it would be. But by Bechor, it says Peterechem. It's the natural process of passing through the womb of the mother. That's what consecrates it. Yes.
I have a question. When a poor person who cannot afford an animal or a bird, you can bring flour as a chatas.
No, not always. No. If a poor person violates Shabbos inadvertently, for that kind of chatos, it has to be an animal. He cannot bring a bird, cannot bring a meal offering. That has to be an animal.
What if he can't afford it?
So he doesn't. He borrows the money. What happens? He can't afford Dalit Kosos. The Gemara says you got to borrow the money. You can't get it from the charity. You have to borrow.
The question I wanted to ask though was that the flour that he takes as a chatas is deficient already because it's not consecrated until he puts it into the ministering vessel, whereas the animal or the bird is consecrated right away.
Correct.
Again, Hashem says, right?
Has nothing to do with it. Nothing, but it's for a different reason. It's a different reason. Because the flour, as I said, the flour is made up of granules. Let's say you have an animal that's missing a leg and you consecrate it.
There's no nefesh.
No, nothing nefesh. No, it has nothing to do with nefesh. An animal is an entity unto itself. It's a fully integrated entity, which every aspect of it is part of that same entity. You take, let's say you have to have 5 pounds of flour. That's the volume for a mincha. Whatever the volume is. There, every granule of flour is a separate granule. It's only they happen to be accumulated in one location, now you have that volume. But what causes them to become one entity? You have to, let's say a person puts less than the minimum amount in that ministering vessel. Does it assume Kedushas mincha? It doesn't become a mincha. You have to have minimally that amount, the minimal amount. When you put that in, then the ministering vessel says, now it becomes an entity called mincha. Until then, you see it as granules. Let's say I have the measure. I only have half. I said, I'm consecrating this flour to be used as a mincha. It assumes a kedusha, but not the kedusha of the mizbeach. That's designated to be used for the mincha. So when I have enough flour together, now I put a mincha vessel, now it becomes a mincha.
Right, but it's deficient in its nature before, rather compared.
But why is it? Why is it deficient? A bird is not deficient because you have to have a shear. You have to have minimum volume. And since until you put it in the vessel, you don't see it as one entity, so you don't have a sufficient volume. The animal is the animal. The bird is the bird. The amount of flour is only seen as one entity when it goes into the ministering vessel. That combines it to be seen as one entity.
So I'm asking you, so you have the 5 pounds of flour, it's an entity before you put it into the ministering.
No, it's not. It's not an entity. Because every bit of that flour is a granule. I'll give you an example. What's the halacha? Have a piece of meat. And something contaminated touches that meat. One touches the edge of that meat. What happens? The whole piece of meat becomes contaminated. What about if I have flour on a table? And it's a continuous mass of flour. And a sheretz touches one end of that flour. Is all the flour contaminated? The answer is no. Because every bit of that flour is a separate entity. It's only the flour the sheretz actually touched. All the other flour, although it's connected, physically connected, it's not contaminated. Because you see, every bit of that flour is a separate entity. They happen to be next to one another, but it's a separate entity.
Rabbi?
Where do we find something similar? Okay, now, there's a question. The Torah says that a person is contaminated if he immerses himself in the mikveh, he's tor. At the right time, and he meets all the criteria, he's relieved of that contamination. Now, a mikveh to me, a mikveh, how much water you have to have in there? You have to have 40 so. 40 so is equivalent of 180 gallons of water. Now, what's the halacha? What does the word mikveh mean? It means gathered water. It's water gathered in one location. Correct? Like it says, time of creation, Yikov HaMayim. Hashem said on the third day of creation, Yikov HaMayim, let the waters gather and the dry land be seen. So the word mikveh means it's gathered in one location. In Mishnah terms, it's referred to as ashboren. It's all gathered within one location. It doesn't flow. What about a mayon? What's a mayon? A mayon's a wellspring. What is the characteristic of the wellspring? It flows. So therefore, a mikveh, if you have a leak in a mikveh and the water is flowing out of the mikveh is not valid. because the water is moving. It has to be contained. A mayon, even if it's moving, the characteristic of a mayon is there's a wellspring. It's continuously churning out water. There's movement. Okay? But the Torah says either one qualifies to relieve a person of tumah. If it's a mikvah or a mayon. Now there's a question in Rishonim, in Halacha, how much water do you have in the mayon to relieve a person of tumah? Do you have to have 40 saw as the mikvah? Or even less than 40 saw? As long as the body's covered, let's say you want to convert a child to be a Jew. Or you have a child at the time when we dealt with spiritual contamination, and you want to immerse that small child in a mikvah. How much water do you have to have? You have to have 40 saw. Anything less than 40 saw is not a mikvah. What about a mayon? The mayon itself has less than 40 saw. And you immerse that child in that. Is it valid? Well, no, you also have to have 40 saw. It's an argument among Rishonim. Now, what's the basis for the argument? Beautiful. What's the halacha? You have a waterfall. It's a mission in mikvos, and you go under the waterfall, and the gush of water that comes upon you as it comes down covers you. Is it valid? Right? You have water cascading down a mountain, and it covers you. Is it a valid tefillah? It's not valid. Okay? It's called katafris. It's not valid. Now the question, why is it not valid? So there's a question why it's not valid. Now, is it if you say that because it's in movement, the only time the water could purify you, relieve you, you have to have a certain measure of water, volume. When the water is in movement, you know what it is? It's every droplet of water is a separate droplet. Okay? And because it's a separate droplet, you don't have 40 saw. 40, if it's contained within walls and it's stagnant, the walls cause the water to be seen as one entity. But if the water is flowing, it's not combined to be seen as one entity. You understand? So therefore, like this, if that's the case, if the nature of a mayon, that's its natural characteristic, it flows automatically, you see it as multiple droplets of water which just have to be associated with one another. And yet the Torah says mayon purifies. So they automatically, they say, one doesn't need a shear of 40 saw by a mayon. Because the reality is, the droplets of water are not seen as one entity. Because you see, the Torah allows it to purify even if it's in movement. So that proves that you don't need a volume of water for mayon as long as you're immersed and covered by the water. It's similar to the flour before it's put in the mixing vessel. You see, every granule of flour as a separate entity. What combines it to be seen as one entity when you put in that mixing vessel? A mikvah, the Torah says you have to have 40 saw. Therefore, it has to be confined within walls. If it should be leaking and it's moving out, you don't have 40 saw. If that's the case, it's not a valid tefillah. But a mayon in its characteristic, in its entity, in its essence, is movement, automatically, that means it does not need shear. You don't need 40 saw for that reason.
Why does a waterfall need shear then? Why doesn't a waterfall work? It's the same as a mayon.
The question is, why is it cascading off? Because once it separates from that, because it's in midair, it's separating from the what's his name? It's separating from the source. We're talking about it has to be connected to the source itself.
But if the water is...
It's coming down midair. It's midair.